In the previous video, we looked at an event binding, such as input or blur and a click event. Now, you may be thinking that event.target might not be a great way of doing things. So what we're actually going to do later on in this course is look at Angular Forms. However, what we're going to do just for this example is import something called the Forms module, just to show you an Angular directive that will allow us to essentially do something called two-way data binding. And I want to demonstrate this earlier on, just to give you an idea that you can use one-way data binding and two-way data binding. Two-way data binding might be okay if you've got a local component. However, when you want to emit a change, you should always use one-way data flow and emit that change with an event listener. So to include this Forms module, we can just simply go down here and import the Forms module. We can close this off because we don't need it. So now we've got the Forms module available to us in Angular. So let's go ahead, and what we'll actually do is change this value binding, because we're actually binding directly to this value property. Instead of this, what we can do is use something called an ng model. Now, ng model comes in various forms. So what we can do is do ng model equals name. So after we've added the ng model, we can essentially get rid of this value. For now, we'll keep the input and the blur events, and we'll go and check this out in the browser just to see what's happening. So when we land in the browser, we can start typing. The ng model that we've just included from the Forms module is actually talking to the input itself. So it's essentially doing this square brackets value that we looked at before for you automatically. So we're demonstrating this because we can now go back and implement the ng model change. So inside of here, what we'll do is get rid of the blur event, and instead of handle input, we'll just call this handle change. What we'll do first is go down and change the handle input. We'll get rid of the handle blur, and what we'll also do is get rid of the event.target.value. And we'll just rename this to value, and the value that it's going to give us is actually a string. So when the handle change function gets called, it's going to pass us an event string. Now the way that we can do this is using ng model change. So you can see here that we're binding using ng model, but we're listening to a change event because this is an event binding. So when something changes, handle change will get called, the event is given to us. So let's save this out and go back to the browser. And again, we can go and start typing, and you can see that this two-way data binding is essentially happening. So ng model is taking a property binding, ng model change is taking an event binding. Now, the reason we're demoing this is to demonstrate the two-way data binding. This is technically one-way data binding, which listens to a change via an event, and then we rebind it. So we can actually use the ng model to create an implicit two-way data binding. So what we can do is leave this example with the handle change event and the handle change function here. However, we don't need this line of code if we want to implement two-way data binding with ng model. All we need to do is simply wrap it in these braces. So at first this might look very strange. We have a property binding, and inside of that we're listening to an event binding. So under the hood, Angular is essentially going to run all of this code for you. It's going to run some form of handle change, and then it's going to update the name internally. So when we go back to the browser, we can actually see this happening. So when we go back to the browser, I can focus on the first input. Now this input is using the handle change function, whereas this input is using the two-way data binding syntax. So it doesn't matter which I update, the two-way data binding is happening on this input. The one-way data binding is happening on this put. However, we are responding to the ng model change event. So using the square bracket notation essentially combines the two to make the syntax even shorter for us. So that's an overview of how to do two-way data binding. Ideally, you would do this for an input only or a text area, for example, rather than just components itself, because it's much easier to manage your data and the state of a component and a template by using one-way data flow and event binding.